Hey everyone, Duke Nougat 3D here, taking a look at more junk in my closet, and today I have for you a couple variants of the M1A1 or M2A1 training mask. I've already covered this series of masks before on my channel. I believe it's under the video about the E20R20 canister, of which I have two examples now here. One of which, on the left, obviously that black face piece example, which I will describe a bit more in detail in a moment, belongs to Moulage and has been sent to me just for preservation and looking after it while he's away. But nevertheless, let's get into the history. I've already touched base on the M2 series training and service masks were pretty much the first service mask adopted by the US military, which used a solid injection molded rubber face piece, as opposed to the earlier M1 series service masks, which were a flat sheet of rubber which were sewn and basically, in order to get that shape, they had to have a chin seam at the bottom, and it was not really conducive to mass production nor for durability. So the M2 series was derived from the E41 series the E41 series experimental face blanks, which were sort of an offshoot of the E32 series masks, which were touched base on Moulage's Polmasan and Wilson masks. I'm not sure if that's on my channel. You could go ahead and check out his channel if you want to know more about that. But anywho, when push came to shove, there was basically two competing designs, both developed by Acushnet, which were the E32R22, if I got that name correct, service face piece, which was the original injection molded mask that Acushnet had developed, and then the E41R43 face piece, which is what you see there on the left. Now, the E41 experimental face piece you see there on the left went through a series of revisions in order for it to get adopted. They were adopted initially early on with some of these earlier defects, but were later improved as other companies got a hold of the molds and began developing their own attributes, which I will get to in a moment. But first, let's take a look at some of the kit. First up, obviously, the E20R20 training canister, which you've seen in my previous video on that. Not really much to say about them. They're typically found in this condition, often worse. They're usually all dented up like this, but on very rare occasions they can be found in better condition, but that is not usually the case. Getting into this pile of mess over here. This is actually the original head harness, the original M4 head harness for this particular mask, but these early M4 harnesses are prone to basically getting all shredded to ribbons and such, so that's a bit unfortunate, but it is present. I'll probably put that in a little plastic bag for Moulage when he's ready to receive this mask again. And then the carrier, which is actually, this is a very interesting example of the carrier because it is identical to the M1 series non-combatant mask carriers, as in it has a simple glove snap for closure rather than the lifted out, which is more common on these carrier bags. But yeah, it's just otherwise, it's a typical M1 carrier for a M1A1 training gas mask. You sometimes will see, for the original M2 or the M1 training mask, which has a M4 Acushnet style valve, which is a valve disc on the front instead of this M5 Connell valve, as you see. The original M2 training mask, or M1 training mask, whichever you prefer to call it, the carriers for those would normally just be marked training gas mask, or on some occasions training gas mask M1. We get that to focus there, and then obviously you can see the US and Chemical Corps insignia stamps. You can see the leg or the waist strap, which is all braided up. That's a pretty common sight to see with these carriers because they were kind of not necessary. You have the buckle for the or the D-ring or whatever you prefer to call it for the waist strap, and then you have a very thin shoulder strap here made out of a webbing material and uses a standard harness buckle for adjustment. And then there's nothing to see inside except for some markings. You can see M1 carrier, that's probably the company that produced it, and then the lot number. And then this is a issue stamp. This particular example was actually issued. And you can see markings of a 52 or A52. I'm not sure what that refers to. If anyone has a more educated answer to that, feel free to let me know. And now let's get on to the face pieces themselves, because that's where all the interesting stuff is. So, on first appearance, it doesn't look like there's too much different other than maybe a few minute mold changes, because obviously this is an Acushnet face piece. This one's made by General Tire and Rubber Company, and the Acushnet face pieces are noteworthy for their much rounder nose bulges, so to speak. But this one actually has a few additional features which make it a bit earlier. For instance, and the main and most notable one, it is made out of a black rubber. This is not neoprene. A lot of people will assume that because it is black rubber, it is neoprene, but a lot of these early M2 training and service masks were made out of a recycled or reclaimed black rubber that Acushnet was famous for, and they were later produced of the more common Class B gray rubber, as it is known. But anyway, that's the initial way to tell. And then the other point is, notice how barren the harness is right here. Most of you who are savvy with World War II U.S. masks know that later on the molds were adapted to include this little vestibule here, which is a rifle skid, as it is known. And the purpose of this was because they were finding that while the this earlier facepiece, they were having issues with the butt of the rifle catching up against this lower harness rivet, and so it would cause the mask to potentially break its seal. And so what they did was they just added this little bump there below the harness rivets so that the rifle may skid off and over that harness rivet instead of catching on it. Seems kind of ridiculous, but I guess it had its purpose, and they later on got rid of this feature entirely with the M3 service facepiece, which obviously moved the lower harness rivet a bit further out and up rather than having it riveted directly onto the face blank. But as you can see on these earlier face blanks, they did not have the rifle skids. Some of these, and it's more common to actually see these, well, not, I say common, but these are actually very, very hard to find. But anywho, it's actually not common to find these with M5 Acushnet valves. It's actually more common to see these with the original M4 Acushnet valves. So having an early rifle skidless example with a Connell valve is actually somewhat quite rare, to be honest with you. And then you can see, typical as per these early injection molded face pieces, all the wire and tape is covered up with rubber bands, and the rubber was actually loose enough for me to be able to pull all these components off without undoing or damaging anything. So that's actually kind of a plus with this, is that if you're wanting to display this and have components removed, usually the rubber's loose enough to where you can pull these off without damaging anything or having to undo wire and tape. You got some lot markings on the lower harness strap, and you got some markings on the chin over here. If I let the camera focus for a second. Give me one moment. Oh, darn it. Come on. That's not what I want, camera. Come on. Ah, it's not letting me focus. Let's try this. Come on. There we go. You see a lot, which there's no lot number, interestingly, and then the Acushnet stamp. Below that is a M6, which I'm not entirely sure what that refers to. Maybe the rubber blend. I'm not entirely sure. There's no dates on a lot of these early Acushnet masks, unfortunately, so it's hard to tell when this one was made. And then you have the experimental designation E41R43. So that's what that would have looked like. And then alternatively, on the general tire and rubber example, you have basically your typical, see, this is a later rendition of the facepiece, which is E41R102. So they went through a lot of revisions of these face blanks to get them to the specific, the specifications that they needed for this. And I'm sure that there was a ton of, I'm sure that the revisions also counted for different manufacturers' molds, because obviously the general tire and rubber has a different nose profile than the Acushnet one, and so on and so forth. But you can see it's just basically the same principle. Not really much different about them mechanically, other than the absence of the rifle skid on the E41R43. But other than that, pretty much the same thing. They just later produced them out of gray rubber, and that was that. So I have seen a couple examples of these earlier face blanks, not necessarily the E41R43, which lacks the rifle skids, but one of the later ones, which does have rifle skids. I've seen a lot of these converted into M2 service masks, or M2A2, with the M8 style disc valve, rather than the, obviously these were it was quite frequent that the U.S. military would take some of these older training masks and reconvert them into M2A2s later on in the war, when they were using up all of their stocks of M2A2s to produce M4 lightweight service masks. And it was just a whole clusterfuck of just rearranging and retrofitting different examples into entirely new masks. So that's all I have to really say about this. Thank you again to Moulage for sending me this. This will be safely returned to you once you're back home. And that's basically everything. If you have any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns, drop them down in the comment section below, hopefully related to the video, and I will see you all later.